Hello and welcome to today's video. Today's video is a little bit different from normal and it's a little bit personal, and I have been wondering whether or not to do this for a while, but I decided why not. So a few days ago I sat down and actually wrote out everything that I wanted to say. I'm not going to read it, but I've just got some notes so I kind of keep my train of thought, hopefully. So if you see me looking down, I got the notes in front of me here. Anyway, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns. I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website YarnAddict.co.uk. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. I really appreciate you spending your time with me, so thank you for watching. So today I'm going to share kind of my knitting and design story. So how I got started knitting, how long I've been knitting for, and how I got started designing. I grew up in Norway, so if you hear an accent, I'm Norwegian. I grew up in Norway. My mum was always knitting. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, I think she could knit. I'm pretty sure she could knit, and I'm pretty sure she did knit. But I mainly remember her crocheting. She was very good at crochet, did these amazing like fine lace tablecloths and things. And I do actually have a couple of her items downstairs, which I'm quite pleased about. And my other grandmother, she was very into embroidery. She was probably taught to knit as well, because I guess when they grew up, all girls were taught to knit, but she was really into embroidery and cross stitch. And my oldest cousin is the same age as me. And my grandmother would teach us how to crochet and how to cross stitch and teach us all that together. And because my grandparents lived close to my cousins and my cousins used to go there after school sometimes, I think he just got more help with stuff than I did, and I'm pretty sure he was better at both crochet and cross stitch than I was. But I got really into knitting, and I don't know, I kind of feel like maybe I got into knitting because I was better at that than my cousin. I don't know, I may not have been, I can't remember, but that's kind of seems to be what I remember. A few years ago I asked my mum if she remembers teaching me to knit and how old I was when I learned to knit, and she said she doesn't remember teaching me to knit and that I've just always been knitting. There is a saying in Norway that Norwegians are born with skis on their feet, so maybe I was born with knitting needles in my hands. I was definitely not born with skis on my feet because I was never that good at skiing. I think when they talk about skiing, they mean cross-country skiing, and I was never that good at cross-country skiing. By the way, if you can hear bird noise, bird song or other noise, I do have the window open because it's quite warm in here already this morning, even though it's only about 9:20. It's already getting quite warm outside, so I got the window open. So if you can hear any noise, it's just because I got the window open. So I don't remember learning to knit, and I think the first thing I remember knitting was when I was a teenager, but I know that I was knitting before then. We were taught to knit at school. I can't remember how old we were, but sometime in primary school, I guess, and I already knew how to knit. So I guess I learned to knit at some point as a child, but I don't really remember knitting anything specific or anything like that. So the first thing I kind of remember knitting was probably as a teenager. I remember knitting these socks, my first pair of socks, and it was this like red and white like marled yarn, thick wool yarn, and I hated it. And why would people knit socks? It's the most boring thing ever. So I remember knitting a lot as a teenager. I was a teenager in the 80s and knitting was very popular, and we were allowed to knit at school. We had a very long lunch break, so sometimes in the summer we had to go outside. In the winter we were allowed to stay in the classroom because being outside for that long is quite cold, so we were allowed to stay in the classroom if you wanted to, and we would sit and knit, or I would sit and knit, and we were also allowed to sometimes knit in class. If the teacher was just talking and we were just listening, we were allowed to knit in class because I guess they kept us quiet. And I remember knitting various things. I knitted some like Norwegian stranded colourwork jumpers. I probably did one of those as a teenager, I think. And I just made a lot of stuff up. I didn't really like following patterns, but I remember knitting a lot as a teenager. And then when I was 20, I moved here. First I moved to the States for a year, and I didn't knit at all when I was in the States, and then I moved here when I was 20. And when I lived in Norway, knitting was very much a winter activity. So it was something I did in the autumn and the winter when it got dark early and it was too cold and I didn't want to go outside in the evenings. In the summer I would be out later because it was light really late, and I'd be out with my friends and stuff and come home later and then go to bed. Whereas in the winter, it was less attractive to go out after dinner because it was dark and cold and horrible. So I was more likely to stay home and do some knitting. So knitting was very much like a winter activity. And I wouldn't say I was like addicted to knitting back then. I mean, I was a keen knitter, but you know, it was just something I did in the winter because that's what you did in the winter in Norway in those days. So when I moved to England when I was 20, my English was fluent, but I didn't understand knitting patterns, obviously, because knitting is quite a specialised language. And the first 18-20 months I was here, I worked at the riding stable, so I worked like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, so there wasn't much spare time, so I didn't do any knitting. And then I got married to my husband. He wanted me to knit him a Norwegian sweater, so when we were in Norway at some point, I bought a knitting pattern and the yarn to go with it, and I knitted him a sweater. I also knitted one for me, not matching ones. And I would, when we went to Norway, I would buy a pattern and the yarn to go with it and bring it back and knit it, and then the next time I went, I would buy another pattern and yarn to go with it. In those days, if you bought a pattern, even if you bought a pattern book, you had to buy the yarn. They wouldn't let you just buy the pattern or the pattern book. And once we had kids, especially the first 2 years, when you're flying with children under 2, I'm assuming it's still the same now, but it was back then. When you're flying with children under 2, you don't get a luggage allowance. So they expect you to fit all your stuff and all your baby stuff into the same luggage. Obviously, they were a bit more relaxed about luggage allowance back then. So I kind of stopped buying yarn, because I just couldn't fit a sweater's worth of yarn in my suitcase. I remember going in, because we had a local shop where I live. I lived in the same town I live now, and we had a yarn shop in town. It was called a wool shop, still called a wool shop. They don't actually sell that. They do sell yarn in there, but they actually do a lot of shoes. Probably their main business, I would say now, is shoes. And I used to go in there and ask questions and ask for help, and I think they got fed up with me asking for help, so they sold me this like learn to knit booklet, which wasn't really what I needed. I didn't understand English knitting terminology. I think they thought I could knit, which I could, but I remember I bought a pattern for like a baby sweater, toddler sweater, and I got really frustrated with it because it was all knitted in pieces, and I think I gave up, and I don't think I ever finished it. I don't remember ever finishing it. So I kind of gave up knitting again. I got into cross stitch for a few years. Then fast forward a few years till my kids were in primary school. At some point when my daughter started school, I was in a car accident as a teenager and I hurt my neck when I was 14, and then around the time when my oldest daughter started school, I was in another car accident and I hurt my neck even more. And after that, I was on sick leave for a long time. I was working part-time for the local authority where we live, and I was on sick leave for a year. I tried to go back halfway through that year and lasted 4 weeks maybe, and then I was signed off on sick leave again for another 6 months, and then I was eventually gave up work completely because I realized there was just no way I could do like an office job. So I was at home. My oldest daughter was at school, my youngest daughter wasn't. The start of that, I didn't mind not working because I had a daughter at home and I was quite busy, and just getting through every like day to day was a struggle because of the amount of pain I was in. I was on quite strong painkillers and I was getting depressed because of the pain, and I was enjoying being at home, but it was a struggle to get through every day. Just doing all the kids stuff with the kids and keeping on top of the housework and stuff was a struggle. If I cleaned the bathroom, like in the house we live in now, which we moved into 26 years ago, I think, we have an ensuite, shower room, a bathroom and a toilet downstairs. So if I went to clean the main bathroom, for example, I would clean it and then I had to lie down for half an hour. Then I could clean the ensuite and then I had to lie down for half an hour. If I hoovered, I could hoover downstairs and then I had to lie down for half an hour. If I was ironing, I ironed for 5 minutes, sit down for 5 minutes, iron for 5 minutes. It was kind of, I had to really pace myself. Eventually we got a cleaner and that helped a bit, but it was still a struggle just to get through the day-to-day everything. And I got depressed at times and it was not a good time. It was looking back, it was really, really hard, and depression was definitely a problem for me. And then when my youngest daughter went to school, I always had a bit more time, but by that time we'd actually decided that even though I wasn't working, I wasn't disability benefits at the time, we decided that we would spend some of that money on paying for a cleaner. At the time, a cleaner where we lived wasn't very expensive, so we got a cleaner. And because I was just really struggling, and my husband was working full time and he was commuting each way, so he got home late and he was tired. I was struggling to get through the day and keep on top of the housework, so we got a cleaner once a week just to kind of do the basics, just so that things were ticking over, if you like. And I actually had a cleaner right through, not the same cleaner, I've had 3 different cleaners, but right through till the start of the pandemic. And the last cleaner I had has been with me since my kids were still at primary school, and they're in their mid and late 20s now. So very sad to lose her at the start of the pandemic. But now, because Simon's working from home most of the time, we're kind of sharing the housework between us, and things are a lot easier. Since my kids left home, things became a lot easier. As they got older, I got less busy because they were more independent, so things got easier. But at one point, I was very, very depressed, and I was on antidepressants for a while, which made me more depressed. I came off those eventually. And yeah, things was just hard. And when my daughter went to school, I would take the kids to school, come home, sit and watch daytime telly, go back and pick them up from school, do a bit of housework during the day in between watching daytime telly. And most of my friends were working at least part-time, and I just got really bored and quite down, really. So then my kids, when they were coming towards the end of primary school, I think it was, or halfway through primary school or something like that, these fluffy, furry, fake fur type scarves were really popular, and lots of their friends had them, and they were saying, oh, we want those scarves, Mum, everyone's got them. So I asked a few mums at school, where they got them from, expecting there to be like a local shop or something, and they were all like, oh, Granny knitted it. And I was like, well, English Granny doesn't knit. I mean, she can knit, but she hadn't knitted anything for a long. I'd never seen her knit, so I have been told she did know how to knit, but I'd never seen her knit. So I was like, okay. Norwegian Granny lives too far away, so I was like, okay, I better knit some. I can knit a scarf. I've knitted sweaters. I can do a scarf. So I went into the local yarn shop, the wool shop, and I got some yarn. I got some like furry, fake fur, whatever they were, eyelash yarns, whatever they used to be called, and some needles. I knitted a scarf. I knitted another scarf. I knitted another scarf, and then I kind of perfected a pattern that I remember I used 8mm needles, so it was a bit looser, and I did garter stitch so I could get a short scarf out of 150-gram ball of eyelash yarn. And I knitted a little bit, and then I cast off some stitches in the middle of the row, and then cast them on the next row, so you had like a slit. And I knitted till I got to the end of the ball, and then when you put the scarf around you, you could thread one end through the slit, and it just sat across your neck like that. And it was really short, and it looked quite nice. So I made some of those, and one of my neighbours saw them, and she asked me to knit some for her for Christmas so she could give them as presents. So I did that. I could knit one in the time it took to watch a movie, because I remember we went to the cinema and I knitted one while I was watching the movies. So that's when I started knitting at the cinema. It was just garter stitch. It was easy. So we were joking that, I would knit a scarf and it'd pay for the cinema trip. And I tried to sell some on eBay. So I think that first winter, I probably knitted like, I don't know, between 80 and 100 of these scarves. And eventually I got a bit bored of these eyelash scarves. Around the same time, I discovered the internet. We got a laptop, and or maybe a computer, I can't remember. And I thought, well, what do you do when you surf the internet? So I remember it was when we had dial-up, and I remember just searching for knitting one day and found this online yarn shop, and ordered some yarn because they had a lot more exciting stuff than they did in my local yarn shop. And I also found an online forum, which I became a member of. And that online forum, I would say, probably definitely changed my knitting career. At the time, I discovered that people were knitting bags. So I tried to knit a few bags. I knitted a few very simple bags in like novelty yarns, and I'd buy like the handles and attach them. And I tried to sell some. I would line them with felt because felt was easier to sew for somebody who wasn't a sewer than like cotton fabric. So I would make some bags and I tried to sell them at local craft fairs. I discovered felted bags, which were a big thing at the time. There's an American designer and she specialised in felted bag, and I can't remember what they were called. Something with N. Nomi? The company, that is, not the designer. Something with N. I can't remember what it was called. But they did loads of felted bags. So I bought some of their patterns. I discovered another online yarn shop called Get Knitted in Bristol. Anyone remember Get Knitted? And the original yarn shop I discovered was called Angel Yarns, and they had an online forum which I became a member of. And I discovered knitting blogs, and I thought, this is fun. And I thought, maybe I could write a knitting blog. I've got loads of time because I still wasn't working. So I started writing a knitting blog. So I started my blog in 2006. I actually went on it the other day. I haven't updated my blog since 2020. April 2020 was the last blog post I posted on there. And I started blogging in 2006, and that was after I discovered this online knitting group and all the rest of it. Anyway, in this online knitting group I met a lady called Joyce who lived in Devon, which is the county next to where I live, and she was about to open a yarn shop in the town called Bovey Tracy, and the shop is called Spinner Yarn, which you may have heard me talk about before. And when she opened the shop, I went up there. It's an hour's drive from us. And I drove up there, and the shop was amazing. It was tiny. The first shop was tiny, but it was amazing. It was filled with so much beautiful yarn. She got some brands from New Zealand that were a bit different. And I just loved going up there and seeing the yarn. And she started a knitting group. So I started going up to her knitting group every month. You know, I wasn't working, my kids were at school, so I would drive up there, go to the knitting group for the morning, drive home, and then I'd be in so much pain I would like lie on the sofa till I had to pick the girls up from school. But it was worth it because I got to see other knitters and things like that. And then she started running online courses with a lady called Claire Crompton, and I took some of Claire's courses. She did some courses in design, which I took, some workshops, and I took a finishing workshop. And then Joyce was asked to run sock classes, but Claire was her only knitting teacher at the time, and Claire didn't knit socks. So somebody, I think it might have been Claire, suggested me because I knitted a lot of socks. And at the time I'd started designing a bit, and I'd started getting my head around how to write up patterns. I really struggled getting into British patterns and the terminology, but being a member of an online knitting group really helped me, because if I wasn't sure about something, rather than going into the local yarn shop where they got a bit fed up with me asking for help all the time, I could go to the online group and people would help me. And I saw that people were knitting socks out of this really colourful yarn, which turned out to be opal. So I bought some opal yarn. I thought, socks are a bit boring. I don't want to knit socks. I remember enjoying knitting socks, but I knitted a pair in opal yarn. I thought, oh, this is quite good fun. So I got into knitting socks, and then the online group I was in at some point I left the original online group and we started a new one, and that kind of thing. I can't remember all the exact details now, but a new one was started at some point because some of us got kicked out of the original one. I was one of them. So somebody was talking about doing like a design competition for socks or something, and I was like, oh, I can't design socks. And somebody basically said, just take a basic sock pattern and add a stitch pattern. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess it is that simple. So I took like a basic 60 stitch sock pattern and I added the stitch pattern, and the first sock came out perfectly, and then the second sock, when I transitioned from the leg to the foot, the stitch pattern didn't line up. So I'd obviously done something wrong where I put the heel. So I learned a bit from that. Anyway, that kind of got me into sock designing, and then I eventually would like play with the stitch counts and things like that. And that got me into designing socks, and I eventually started up a free sock pattern club, which I think was called Sock Mania. I think I did it for like nearly 2 years, because obviously back then there wasn't social media, there wasn't Ravelry. So how did knitters find you? How did you sell your patterns online? I mean, I had no idea. I started selling them online on Etsy, I think, and at some point I decided I needed a website. I obviously had my blog, but at the time Etsy didn't do downloadable digital downloads, so I had to, if I got an order, I had to email out the pattern, which was a bit of annoying. And yeah, I got into designing. My first designs were awful, but I did it. I didn't know you were supposed to have tech edit your patterns, but I just wrote them up and proofread them a million times. Eventually I met somebody who lived in Devon who did some test knitting for me, and she was brilliant. She test knitted for me and sample knitted for me for years. So going back to spinning yarn, Joyce asked me if I could teach a sock knitting workshop, which I said yes to. I had never taught a knitting workshop. I did used to teach horse riding when I first moved here. That's what I did. My first job here was teaching horse riding. So I had a bit of teaching experience, I guess, but I hadn't taught knitting. I did have a qualification in teaching horse riding, but I hadn't obviously taught knitting. But I was like, how difficult can it be to teach 6 adults who already know how to knit socks? And I can't remember how that first workshop went, but I guess it must have gone well, because here we are, however many years later, and I'm still teaching. So that one workshop at Spinning Yarn, next term Joyce asked me to do it again, and then people were commenting on how I was knitting and how fast I was. So I said, well, maybe we want to do a continental knitting workshop, because people seem to really be fascinated by the way I knit. So we did that, and then I got into lace knitting, so we eventually added the lace knitting workshops, and then it just spiraled from there. And for a few years, that's the only place I was teaching, was Spinning Yarn. And then other shops started approaching me to teach and things like that, and it just spiraled. And now I do a lot of teaching, but that's how I got started teaching. So back to designing. So I was dabbling in design, not being very good. There was a British online kind of pattern website or magazine at the time called Magnets. Anyone remember them? I submitted a pattern to them and they published it. It was a sock pattern, a very simple sock pattern. They published it, and then I submitted a pattern for a lace shawl, and the lady who ran it asked me if she could use it in a new print magazine she was setting up. So she was starting an independent print magazine called Yarn Forward. Anyone remember Yarn Forward? So I got this lace pattern got published in Yarn Forward. Then I designed another one which she published, and then at some point I got introduced to a designer who designed a lot for knitting and Let's Knit knitting magazine and Let's Knit, who lived locally to me. Somebody introduced us, and I was telling her that I was kind of getting started as a designer. She had written books and everything by that point, so she was way more experienced than me. Anyway, she put me in touch. She encouraged me to contact the editor of Let's Knit and Knitting, which I did, and my next pattern got published in Let's Knit magazine. And then things just spiraled, and then when the knitter came out, I started submitting to the knitter and Simply Knitting, and I submitted to some of the American magazines like Interweave Knits, Vogue Knitting. Had a lot of patterns published by Vogue Knitting and some of their other magazines, because the publisher who publishes Vogue Knitting also publishes other magazines, and they do a lot of books for various young companies and collections and things like that. So I've contributed to quite a few books from them over the years, and I've been in Vogue Knitting, Interweave Knits. Then at Spinning Yarn, they were doing fashion shows to start with, because they were a Rowan stockist. They would do Rowan fashion shows, and I used to go along every time. And, you know, 1 or 2 Rowan designers would come along, like Martin Story, because he lived in Devon at the time. So one year they did a Debbie Bliss fashion show, and Joyce, who owned the shop, asked me to come up, and she said, do you want to come up early and meet Debbie, because I'm picking her up from the train station, I think. And she said, if you want to come up early and come up to the shop, you can meet Debbie, and then, you know, come down to the fashion show afterwards. So I was like, yeah, I'd love to meet Debbie Bliss. So I turned up at the yarn shop, and I've been thinking on the way there, how can I kind of ask Debbie Bliss if she uses freelance designers, because I assumed she designed all her stuff herself. I was like, I wonder if she uses freelance designers. How can I kind of get in? And at that point, I'd been publishing quite a few magazines and things, so it wasn't like I was a complete newbie anymore. But I met Debbie Bliss. She was lovely, one of the nicest kind of big name designers that I met. Some others have not been so friendly, but she was lovely. She was really nice, and I've only been in the shop for like a few minutes when she said to me, oh, so do you do work for other people? I was like, yes, of course I do. And she said, well, can you design a shawl for me? It's like, yes, I can. So I designed a lace shawl that went on the cover of her magazine, And at the time when her magazine, I think it was mainly it was produced by the company that produced Vogue Knitting. So I think it was mainly produced for the American market. So that was quite a big thing because it went on the cover and I was so excited. That was probably one of the highlights of my career, that and a cover of Vogue Knitting. Around about the same time, I think. Anyway, going back a few years, when my kids were at school, I started designing and I was still on disability benefits. But one of the things that knitting really did for me, so when I started knitting again and my kids were at school, primary school, and instead of coming home and just sitting there and watching daytime telly all morning, in between trying to do a few chores in the house and getting quite depressed. I also didn't have the car most of the time because we only had one car and my husband was lift sharing, so some days I didn't have the car, so I couldn't do very much, and I felt a bit, we didn't really have that much money because I wasn't working, so I got quite depressed at times. And when I started knitting, I would come home, I would do some chores, sit down, watch daytime television and get my knitting out. Then I would do some other chores, sit down, watch daytime television and get my knitting out. So by the time I went to pick the girls up from school, I felt like I had achieved something because I could see this piece of knitting that I'd knitted and I could think, right, at least I've done that today. So it gave me like a sense of achievement, and I really do think that getting back into knitting really helped me get out of that kind of depressive state. I know if you are depressed, maybe that sounds a little bit light-hearted. I mean, I've been on antidepressants, so I know what it's like. For me, antidepressants didn't work. Might just be the ones I was on, I don't know. But I do feel like knitting really helped me get out of that kind of really depressive mood, and it gave me a sense of achievement, and it snowballed into other things which improved my life immensely. Things kind of spiraled and went along like that. I had a design on the cover of Yarn Forward magazine, and the yarn company that distributed that yarn, they contacted me because yarn companies take notice when your design hits the cover. Gets more attention when it's on the cover, I learned. And this yarn company called Artisano contacted me and asked me to do some designs for them using one of the yarns they were distributing called Monosol Uruguay, which is a lot of the yarn on the shelves behind me. And Artisan also had their own yarn. So I spent several years doing a lot of designs for them. Yeah, loads and loads of designs for them. And then in 2016, they wanted to host some workshops from their kind of warehouse in Berkshire. And so I went up and taught workshops. I would go up and teach workshops, like 3 workshops over like a long weekend. And I stayed with them when I went up. So I think they did that to save money on paying for me to stay in a hotel. So I got to know them quite well. And that was in January 2020. And I went up several months that year. And then in the summer of 2020, like May, June time, beginning of June, I think, they contacted me and said they were going into receivership. And they actually didn't pay me for the last 3 workshops I had taught there a month before. So it you know, I spent years designing for them. I'd spent several months teaching for them. I'd been in their home. I'd had meals with them. I'd met their daughter, spent like the whole evening with them, and felt like I was really getting to know them. And then I had an email saying, we're going into receivership. It'll be announced tomorrow. Sorry, we can't pay you. So I lost quite a lot of money, and that was quite upsetting. But life moves on, and I was being published regularly in magazines, teaching regularly, and things have just grown from there. And at some point, can't remember exactly when, but after I started teaching and designing and being published in magazines, I was thinking, well, okay, I'm earning money now. So at the time, you were allowed to claim disability benefits and earn like a tiny amount every week. But once I started getting more work, I was like, right, I need to come off incapacity benefits. And I was due to have because I had to be reviewed every 3 years or something. And I was due for like a review anyway. And at the time, there was a big publicity, a big push to get people off disability benefits. And they were turning a lot of people down and then people were appealing, and then they were winning their appeals. So I was kind of expecting that I wouldn't, because nothing had really changed. I was still in a lot of pain. I still couldn't go back to my old job. I still couldn't work all day. If I spent like the morning writing patterns, I mean, I used to have like a reclining chair in the lounge, and I used to sit in that chair with a laptop on my lap writing patterns, because I couldn't sit at a desk. I ended up in too much pain if I sat at a desk. If I taught a workshop, I wouldn't do anything for the next 2 days. Next day, I would take the kids to school, come home, and just basically spend half the day in bed or just sitting watching telly, because I was in too much pain to do anything. But anyway, I got off in disability benefits, and it was scary to start with, because obviously I didn't know where this was going to go. Was I going to make enough money to replace my disability benefits? Best thing I've ever done was to get off disability benefits, because I just felt so worthless, and because of all the stuff in the media at the time. Every time you turned on the news, there were people complaining about it and calling us scroungers and all that kind of stuff, and it was difficult. And I was embarrassed to tell people that I was claiming disability benefits, because my disability wasn't necessarily visible. You might look at me now and think, she looks fine, she looks quite healthy, she's got a tan, she looks fine. And she's posting about how she works out every morning and walking the dog and things like that. But when we were in Spain a few weeks ago, we spent 2 weeks in Alicante. We rented a city centre apartment. We didn't have a car. We had to walk everywhere. We used a lot of public transport, but we were on the 5th floor without a lift, and walking up and down the stairs, my knees were killing me, my hips were killing me, my back was killing me. I was in all the walking we did. I did 193,000 steps over 2 weeks, and we used public transport as much as we could. But I was in so much pain when we got back from our holiday, and it took me like a week to get over it, really. And still, when I teach, by the end of the workshop and I'm driven home, I'm exhausted. I come home, I'm struggling to stay awake all evening. And the next couple of days, I'm doing a lot less to get over it. Last week, I was up several nights a week in the middle of the night because of pain. So I'm still in a significant amount of pain, but I think I find it easier to manage now, because it's just me and my husband. I don't have kids at home anymore. I don't have, that's less to do. I don't have to cook for a family. I don't have to wash for a family. I don't have to clean for a family. I don't have to run the kids around to various places. So things are a lot easier now. And I think that's really what's helped my pain management, is the fact that things are easier, not having to look after kids anymore. So I love what I do, and I wouldn't have done what I do if I hadn't had this neck pain, and which is now, it's really like upper back pain and neck pain. I've also had some problems with my lower back the last couple of years after a couple of injuries. I've got arthritis in my knees now, and I'm starting to get a bit of problems with my hip when I do a lot of walking and tarmac. So whether there's arthritis there, I don't know. My shoulders are getting worse. Getting a bit of pain here. So, I have a few problems. I still take painkillers every day, so it's not like I'm fully recovered. But I can do this job because I can time myself. So I can work for 45 minutes. I can go downstairs and take a break and sit in a comfy chair and knit for an hour. Then I go back upstairs and do another hour. Then I take a break again. So when I kind of say I work usually from about 9 to 3, 4 o'clock, I usually do 45 minutes, then I walk the dog, then I take a break, then I work for like an hour and a half usually, then I have a lunch break, then I work for like an hour to an hour and a half, and that's it. So I do 3-4 hours a day maybe, but it's split out over most of the day, because that's the only way I can manage. So but knitting really I feel like knitting really saved me from depression and from a life on disability benefits, because I couldn't see myself at the time going back to an office job, even part-time. I could probably, even now, I'm not sure I could manage a part-time office job where I had to do set hours and very restricted breaks, because if I spend all morning working on the computer with just a couple of shorter breaks, I'm in so much pain. And I only do that if I absolutely have to, because I have deadlines. Because I end up in so much pain, then it takes me days to recover. And I couldn't work in a shop and things like that, because being on my feet all day and that kind of thing. So I think this is like the only thing I can do, and I love doing it. So I'm very lucky, but I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have problems with my health and chronic pain. One thing I do want to say, because every time I talk about chronic back pain, I get people who say, have you tried this treatment? Have you tried that treatment? So I mean this in a nice way, so don't get offended if you were sitting there thinking, right, I should tell her about this treatment I tried. I have literally tried everything. I've had problems with my neck since I was 14 years old. I have tried everything. When I saw a neurosurgeon when I was in my early 30s, I had to write a list of all the treatments I'd tried, and he was gobsmacked when he looked at that list. He said he don't think he'd ever met anyone who'd had as many different treatments as I have. I tried everything. Conventional, really weird stuff, way out there stuff. I've had surgery on my neck. Nothing has worked. So I've tried everything. Now I have massage every 2 to 3 weeks, and that kind of keeps me ticking over and on like an even keel, I think. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble a bit now, so I think I'll finish this because I think it's going quite long, and it's 10 o'clock, so I need to go and walk the dog. But yeah, things just started kind of spiraling. I got published in more and more magazines. At some point I got I guess about 8 years ago, maybe, I don't know, this American editor emailed me after seeing my patterns in, I think, some American magazines. She emailed me and said they were looking for somebody to do a lace book, and was I interested? And I was like, yes. And she said, well, you can pitch anything you want as long as it's lace knitting. So I said, well, I'd like to do a beaded lace knitting book. And she was like, oh, maybe that's a bit too niche. And then apparently she went to, I think it was a Rhinebeck festival that weekend, and she emailed me afterwards and she said, no, actually I saw loads of beaded lace shawls and things, so I think you're onto something. You can do beaded lace knitting. So I wrote my book Beaded Lace Knitting, and then I wrote my Easy Lace Knits book. Easy Lace Knits was very difficult. I wrote that at a time when I wasn't feeling very well. I have thyroid problems as well, and my thyroid medication wasn't at the right level, and I also had some other problems, namely vitamin D deficiency at the time, and I was feeling really rough, and I had to ask for a couple of extensions, and I felt quite traumatized after writing that book. And after that I'm like, I don't know if I want to do another book. So I haven't submitted any more book proposals after that, because it was fun writing the 2 books I wrote, but the second book was really hard, and I don't know if I want to do another book. If somebody asked me, I would probably say yes. But I love teaching, I love designing. I'm still published in a lot of magazines. I haven't submitted a lot to American magazines in the last 3 years. I did a design for an American magazine just as COVID was kicking off. And I realized that things were, I can't remember the sequence of things, but I think it was like Italy had shut down. I think things were, you know, from the news it sounded like New York was bad, and I had this deadline was looming, so I quickly finished it, shipped it off with FedEx, and I think it arrived in, I think I shipped it on the same day that New York went into the first COVID lockdown. And I remember checking the tracking, and they couldn't deliver it because the offices had closed. Offices were in Manhattan and they'd closed, and I couldn't get in touch with anyone at the magazine. Nobody was replying to my email. This parcels was stuck in a FedEx warehouse, and I remember it was quite stressful eventually getting it redelivered to the editor's home address. Some of the magazines they used to design for in the States don't publish as many issues as they used to do. Like Vogue Knitting, I think they've gone to like 2 issues a year now, when they used to be like 4 or 5, I think. Vogue Knitting, by the way, has been called designer knitting in Europe for quite a few years. So there are less opportunities in traditional publishing in the States, I think. So I haven't submitted anything for a while because it was quite stressful getting that stuff there when New York went into lockdown. So that was the last time I designed anything, I think. Maybe, have I done one thing since? Maybe. That was for the publishers of, the same publishers that publish Vogue Knitting. Anyway, I think I've shared more or less most of my knitting story now. If you knew me way back when we were members of the Angel Yarns Forum, or if I met you at an open day to Get Knitted, or somebody created another forum after a lot of us left the Angel Yarns Forum. I can't remember what it was called. Was it called Get Crafty or Crafty something? And we had like a day, like a meetup day, where we met up somewhere near Swindon, I think. I remember going on the train to Swindon, and I think somebody picked me up. Anyway, it was a great day. I used to do hand-dyed yarn back then. So if you remember me from back then, let me know. Tell me. I met somebody at Wonderwall who I'd apparently met at this open day from this online yarn forum. which is a long time ago now. So let me know if you remember those days before Ravelry, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Sorry it's gone on for a little bit, but it was fun sharing my story. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.